Guys, today we are going to be making this basic star ornament. So this is actually a little bit different than a couple of the other basic star tutorials that I've done because we're using 3 different fabrics in this instead of 2. So normally I will do an accent fabric in the center and then on the 3rd layer, and that is what I've done here. But instead of doing the same fabric in layer 2 and 4, we've got 2 different fabrics. So that's kind of a fun way to mix it up and add a little bit more interest. And so we're gonna go through making this step by step all the way through the end, even including adding these little pine cones and the ribbon topper. Now I'm gonna go through all the supplies that you're gonna need one by one, but I also wanted to let you know that I do have kits to make this in my Ornament Girls shop. So I'll put a link to that right below this video if you're interested. Otherwise, let's go through all the different supplies that you will need. So first of all, you're going to need a 3-inch foam ball. It really doesn't matter what kind of ball you use as long as it's 3 inches, but it will be helpful if you get the kind of ball that has an equator line going around the circumference of the ball. So what that line does is kind of divides the ball in half into 2 separate hemispheres. And then also it's helpful to have a ball that has the imprint markings on either half of the ball. So in the middle of those hemispheres, you'll have a little imprint on either side. And what that is going to help with is helping you identify the very center of each half of the ball as we start. Because what we're going to be doing is doing one half. We're going to be starting in the middle of one half and working our way out towards that equator line. Then we're going to start over on the other half and work out towards the equator line, meeting both halves in the middle. Now, one other thing that I would recommend is that your ball is a soft foam ball, because there are some brands of foam where the foam is very dense and it's really difficult to push pins into. And we're going to be using a lot of straight pins to hold down our fabric, and it can become very difficult on your fingers if you're pushing into that very dense foam. So you want a soft foam ball. Again, this is something that we carry in the Ornament Girls shop if you're interested. And you can also find similar varieties in some craft stores, but again, some of those don't have the imprint markings either. So those are just some things to look out for. You'll be able to get away with using any 3-inch foam ball, but those things will make your life easier as you're making this ornament. All right, so a 3-inch foam ball. You will need 3 different fabrics, 3 different patterns of fabrics, and it's always best if they are highly contrasting so that you can really differentiate between the layers when you're looking at the finished ornament, like what you'll see here. What I'm using now is Hearthside Holiday by Moda. That's the line that these fabrics are from. And what I have is 24 rectangles that are 2 inches by 3 inches in size of an accent color, and that is going to be the center and then this 3rd layer. So you need 24 pieces of that. You're also going to need 16 pieces of another color, which is going to be kind of the one that shows the most. So I like to think of this as my main color. And I'm using this holly print, also from the Hearthside Holiday. And then you're gonna need a 3rd color, also 16 2-inch by 3-inch rectangles of that, and this is going to be your outer color. You will also need a longer strip of fabric that we're going to be using as the band, and what that's going to do is it's going to cover up all the raw edges when both halves of the ornament meet in the center, like what we talked about a couple of minutes ago. Your band is going to be in the neighborhood of 2 to 2.5 inches in width by about 10.5 inches to 11 inches long. Now in this case, mine is closer to 11 inches, and that's because I'm using the brushed fabric by Moda, which is kind of like a little bit thicker. It almost feels like a thin flannel. So it's a little thicker than regular quilting cotton, which is what the other 2 fabrics are that I'm using. And so because of that, my outer layer is actually going to be a little bit thicker than normal, and so therefore I went with 11 inches long for my band, and that's just a good rule of thumb. Sometimes it can be helpful to wait till you've made the whole ball and then cut your band. That way you can kind of measure the length that you're going to need, and that way in case you mess up and you make it too short, you won't waste fabric. Now to hold all this fabric in place, you're going to need lots and lots and lots of straight pins. So I've got about 230 to 250 straight pins here. And these are size 17, which is dressmaker size pins, and that will work fine. Now, some people like to use longer pins and some like to use shorter pins. That's kind of a matter of personal preference, but a good starting point is the size 17. It's right in the middle, and I find that they're easy to push into the foam. Now to decorate the top, I've got a couple of ribbon bows, and then I've got these cute little pine cones and berries tucked into the bow. So what I've got for the bow is one 24-inch long piece of black ribbon, and then I've also got a 24-inch piece of this burgundy color satin ribbon. And then finally, I've got a shorter piece. This is about 10 to 10.5 inches long. That is going to be used for the hanger. And then for those little pine cone and berry embellishments, I've got these stems. So these are just little pine cone and berry stems that I'm going to cut the stems off of and then tuck into the bow and glue on so that they're held in place. And so that brings me to talking about the tools that you're going to need. You are going to need some glue. You could either use hot glue, which is what I've got beside me, or you can use any kind of clear tacky glue. One type of glue that I really love to use is called Beacons. I like Beacons 3-in-1. That works really well for this. And there are a couple of others, as long as it dries clear and it's tacky so that you can kind of hold those embellishments into place and move them around a little if you need to, and then have time to stick your bow in. That's really all you're looking for. And you're also going to need a pair of wire cutters. Now, honestly, you don't absolutely need these, but we're going to be using them to just kind of trim off these wires off the stem to make it a little bit shorter. Scissors would work for these too because they're very thin wire, but I don't really want to ruin my fabric scissors, so I'm going to use these wire cutters. You're also going to need a sharp pair of fabric scissors. And then finally, you will need a flexible tape measure. Now, if you are interested in one of our kits, the kits contain all of the things except for the actual tools. So we're not going to send you a hot glue gun and fabric scissors or anything like that, but you're going to get all the pins, the foam ball, which is the soft foam ball with all the imprint markings on it. You'll get all this fabric pre-cut in the right sizes for you to make the ornament. You'll get the ribbons and, of course, the embellishments too. So let's go ahead and get started. Now what we're going to be doing is starting in the very center and working our way out, like I said a few minutes ago, which means we're going to be starting with the black fabric. And we're going to need 4 pieces of those black 2-inch by 3-inch rectangles in order to begin that first layer. So I've got my 4 pieces ready here. I'm going to set them right to the side and then go ahead and grab my foam ball. So I've got my first 4 black pieces of fabric ready, and just taking the very first one, and I'm going to hold this so that the pattern side is facing away from me. So it's facing down, and then I'm going to take the top edge and just fold it over just a little bit. It doesn't have to be exact. You don't have to measure or anything like that, but you just want to fold it over a little bit, of probably about 1/3 of the way or so. And we're going to take a pin and just put the pin a hair below that top folded edge and centered lengthwise across the top. And again, you don't have to measure. It doesn't have to be exact. You just want to eyeball it. We're just going to pin that right there, just a hair below that folded edge. And let's go ahead and grab the foam ball. And remember, we talked about those imprints that are in the center of each half of the ball? We're going to start right over top of one of them. Doesn't matter which one. And just stick that pin right down into that imprint. Make sure it's nice and flat on the ball. And then what we're going to do is take the left side and we're going to fold it straight down on itself. So we're covering up the raw edges that we are seeing right here. And we're going to do the exact same thing with the right side. Now when we fold down the right side, we're going to just barely overlap the left side. That way we can take one pin and stick it right down here at the bottom of this triangle that we've just created to hold both of those halves in place. Now we don't want to overlap too much. We don't want to, fold down on an angle a little bit and then fold this on an angle where we've got a whole lot of overlap there. Okay, because we want to keep everything really squared as we're working. So we want to fold that left side straight down and then that right side straight down, just barely overlapping. And that's something to keep in mind throughout the entire ornament. We're going to be doing this exact same fold throughout the entire ornament. So just keep that in mind. And then we're going to go ahead and take that pin and hold down both sides, holding them into the ball. And now we're going to go ahead and we're going to pin down those outer corners. So I'm just kind of taking my thumb and smoothing it down so it's nice and flat, and then repeating that over here on the right side. And now we've got a triangle. So we're going to do the exact same thing again, except that we're going to flip this over and do it directly opposite that first triangle. So I'm grabbing my second piece of black fabric, and I'm going to go ahead and fold over that top edge just a little bit, just like before. And then place my pin a hair below that top folded edge. Now this time I'm going to take my pin and I'm going to put this just up against that very first point that I made. So here is my very first triangle, and that is the center point where I originally pinned that piece of fabric in. You can kind of still see that imprint underneath there a little bit. And we're going to make sure that this new pin is touching that point. And when we push it down, you'll see that the very top folded edge kind of overlaps that tip of the first triangle just a little bit. And that is totally fine, because when we fold down our left side and then our right side, just like we did before, we've made sure that there is no gap between those 2 points. They are just touching each other. And what we want to do here, before we go ahead and place that pin, we want to make sure that the line that is formed down the center of both triangles are lining up really well with each other. We want them to make one straight line. And that is really important, because as we go through the whole ornament, the straighter that we keep all of our lines that are lining up with each other from each piece, then the straighter our finished ornament's going to look. Instead of pieces kind of looking a little bit wonky and our star getting out of shape, if we keep those lines really straight, we'll end up with a really perfect straight star. So again, I used one pin to hold down both of those halves, and now I'm going to repeat the same thing I did before and pin down the left bottom corner and the right bottom corner. So now we've got 2 opposing triangles, and then we've got 2 open spaces to the left and right, and what we're going to do is fill those in with 2 more triangles. So we're going to go ahead and take a third rectangle of fabric. Pattern side, of course, is facing down, and we're going to fold over that top edge just a little bit, placing a pin just a hair below that top folded edge. And then we're going to go ahead and butt this pin up right up into that space between those first 2 triangles, and we want to make sure that pin is touching that fabric. And I'm going to go ahead and push that down in, and then repeat that same triangle fold. So I always call this the basic triangle fold. And what I'm doing now is just kind of shifting that so that it fills the hole. Now, here's the thing. If you end up finding that you've got a gap of fabric that's kind of showing here, you can do a couple of things. So if I actually fold my left side down and then I fold my right side down and I overlap like what I've been doing, I can see that I'm getting, well, it's not really too bad, but there's a little bit of a gap where you can see some of the foam showing through. It's like almost non-existent, but sometimes it can happen, and sometimes it can be a little bit worse than other times. Now, if that happens, what you can do is not overlap the pieces. You can actually just kind of spread them out a tad. That way you are covering more ground and you will not have that gap of foam showing through. And that means that you'll need to use 2 pins down here instead of 1. Now that's not going to happen all that often, but that's just a little trick that you can do if you've got some foam showing there. And again, I'm pinning down my bottom left and right corners to hold them in place. And we've got 1 more spot to fill. So I'm taking my last black triangle for this layer, folding that top edge over just a little bit, and then sticking my pin right there at the top, right below that folded edge. And again, I want to butt this pin up, right up in there, touching all of that fabric, pushing it straight down. and then creating my basic triangle fold. And this time it looks like I'm not having any trouble with that gap, so I can go ahead and use one pin to hold both halves in place. And then I'm going to go ahead and pin down my corners. Now, something I forgot to mention, you probably noticed it though, when I pin down the corners of my third piece, they actually overlap the edges of the triangles on my first layer, and that is totally fine. And the same thing's happening over here. And that's just because we're working on a round shape. If we were pinning this onto a flat shape, then we probably wouldn't have that kind of overlap in the corners, but we're working around a round shape, so that is going to happen, and it's totally normal. So now we are ready to start with layer 2. So for layer 2, we are using the holly fabric. That's our second layer. So I'm going to grab my holly fabric, and we're actually going to be using 8 pieces this time. So the only layer that uses 4 pieces is the first layer of each half, and then all the other layers afterwards will use 8 pieces. So I'm grabbing my first rectangle, and again the pattern side is going to be facing down, and I'm going to fold over that top edge just a little bit. And I'm grabbing a pin, and I'm going to go ahead and pin that right in the top center, a hair below that fold. Now this time we're not going to be starting, of course, in the very center, because otherwise we would just cover up our first layer. We want to kind of bring this layer back just a tad, and I like to go back about 3/8 of an inch or so from the very center point. So you can use a tape measure here and find that point. After you've made a few of these, it becomes easier to eyeball, but in the beginning it really helps to actually take a tape measure, and you're measuring off of that very center point, the very beginning of your ornament. And by the way, just a little trick here, if it is hard for you to see where the center of your ornament is, you could actually stick a pin in there and leave it in there until you're done with half the ball. That way you always have a visual reference for where the center of your ornament is. Again, that's something that gets much easier to eyeball. Once you've made a couple of them, you'll be able to see the center really easily. But I have seen, you know, a couple of people in their very first attempt that they get a little bit lost, and it makes sense. So anyway, we're going to measure off of that, and then we're going to come down about 3/8 of an inch, and I'm actually like about 1/2 of an inch down. So let me move up my pen a little bit. So that's a little bit closer. I'm at about 3/8 of an inch there. And I'm going to go ahead and push that all the way down. And now I'm going to do the exact same technique. I'm doing that basic triangle fold. I'm going to fold my left side down and my right side down. And you know what? I have to be honest. I think I'm going to come down another 1/8 of an inch, because that is a little bit too close. So you want your center star to be small, but you don't want it to be non-existent. I'm pretty close there. So I think that 1/2 of an inch is probably going to be a better measurement to go by. And let me just see if that's where I am. Yeah, so my pin is sitting about 1/2 of an inch below that very center point. And I'm going to go ahead and fold down my left side and my right side. Now again, you want to make sure that the line that you've just created down the center of that triangle stays in line with all of the lines below. So what I'm doing is I'm looking at those lines that were down the center of my triangles from below, and I'm making sure that this new line follows them. Again, that's just so that in the end we have a nice straight star. And I'm just kind of eyeballing it from the side here, and I'm happy with that. So I went ahead and I overlapped my left side with the right side just a little bit so that I could stick one pin in to hold them both in place. And now I'm going to go ahead and smooth down my left and right sides and pin them into place. Now I'm going to go ahead and flip this around and do the exact same thing directly opposite. And this is where you'll find that that pin can kind of come in handy. So something I've seen people do when they go to start this next piece, rather than measuring off the center, sometimes people will accidentally measure from the point of the piece that they just added. So that's another reason why that pin can help. You want to always come off the center the same distance. Let me go ahead and stick my pin back in there. the same distance as what you did here. Now the distance from the center isn't as important, like you just saw, I kind of adjusted mine, as is that you keep all the pieces of this layer consistent. So if you went 1/2 inch from the center on this piece, then you're going to want to do the same thing here. And so what I'm going to do is just grab my tape measure again and make sure that I'm sitting at about 1/2 inch. And that is looking pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and pin that in place. Do my triangle fold. And now I'm going to go ahead and eyeball that line and make sure that it looks like everything is straight. And it looks pretty straight to me. So I'm going to go ahead and pin this down as usual. And there we go. So we're going to do the exact same thing with 2 more pieces directly perpendicular to the 2 that we just did. So I'm getting a 3rd holly piece of fabric and going ahead and pinning right there in the center along that folded edge. And then I'm coming down about 1/2 inch from that center pin. Now again, I'm just looking at my lines, making sure everything's looking like it's pretty straight. And we've got 1 more to go over here. So this is looking a little off. I look like I'm a little too far to the right. So I'm actually just going to pull this out and move it over just a hair. All right, so that is the first 4 pieces of this layer, but we're actually going to do 4 more pieces of this layer with 4 more holly rectangles. So grabbing my 5th rectangle, and again, exact same fold, pinning top center. And now what we're going to do is come down the exact same distance, but we're going to do this in between of 2 of the holly pieces that we just put on. So I'm just going to go ahead and kind of hold my pin there for a second and see where I'm at. Sometimes I actually like to come down just a tad lower on this one. Looks like I'm kind of right there at 1/2 inch, but it actually looks like it's a little bit lower compared to these. When you push that down, it actually looks like it's a little bit lower. You can kind of see the points from the 2 neighboring triangles, but we just measured and it is 1/2 inch from that very center point, so we are good. And I'm going to go ahead and create that basic triangle. Now again, this time I'm following those lines that are still down below. And then we're going to repeat that 3 more times to complete this layer. My fabric is shedding. So I'm kind of eyeballing that this time. So now rather than pinning it before I put it on the ball, I'm just kind of taking a shortcut and pinning directly into the ball. And that is also something that once you make a few of these, it kind of makes things a little bit easier. All right, that is layer 2 complete. Now I'm actually going to go ahead and remove that center pin because at this point it's a little bit easier to see where your center is. You're always going to be looking right in the very center of all of the stars. But if you feel like that has been really helpful for you and you'd like to leave it in, feel free to leave it in. You can leave it in all the way until you're done the entire side if you want to. So now we're going to move back to the black. You can see here we did the black, the holly, and then we did one more layer of that black. This is going to be a thinner layer because it's just an accent. But exact same thing. We're going to go ahead and fold over that top edge and pin a hair below the fold. Now, in order to figure out where to start with this layer, what I like to do is I always like to start over the inner 4 first from the last layer and then do the outer 4. And here's what I mean by that. When we started layer 2, we put on 4 pieces first, then we went back and filled in the remaining areas with 4 more pieces. Well, the ones that we did last are kind of showing more than the ones that we did first. And so I like to call those the outer pieces and these the inner pieces. And just to keep it consistent as you're moving through, just to make sure that it kind of looks like it's all flowing nicely from the center, I like to make sure I keep doing that as I'm working. So I want to begin again on this layer over those first 4 inner pieces. And that's what I'm going to do here. And this time I'm going to come down again about a half of an inch or so. Now just keep in mind I'm over top of an inner piece. I'm coming down about a half of an inch from the point of that piece. Just like this. So here is my very center point. Here is the point of my second layer piece, and then here is where I've just pinned. About a half of an inch, and let me just measure and see if that is correct. Yep, that's about a half of an inch. And I'm going to go ahead and do that exact same fold, folding down the left side and the right side to create my triangle. And again, I want to keep that line that I've just formed in line with all the lines from below. And I'm going to go ahead and use one pin to hold down both halves. And then pin down my 2 bottom corners. And now we're going to come directly opposite and do the other side. Again, I'm measuring about a half of an inch off of that point from layer 2. Which means we're setting about an inch from the very center point because we had come down a half of an inch there and now we're coming down a half of an inch here, so we're about an inch from that very center point. Again, making sure that line is following along. I have to admit, I feel like I need to go back and straighten this one out a little bit. It's a little bit off. That's probably me being a perfectionist because it's not terribly off. It's just a little bit off to me. And then we're going to do the same thing on the other 2 sides. Now, I'm sure by now you're starting to see the pattern. It's pretty simple once you get the hang of it. It's just very repetitive. You're kind of doing the same thing over and over again. And then after a little bit, it starts to form the star pattern. There's piece 3. And piece 4, just eyeballing those lines. And you'll see that we have reached that circumference line. That's totally fine. Now what we're gonna do is the exact same thing over top of those remaining 4 sections of holly. So on this one, I actually like to come down just a little bit more than 1/2 of an inch. I always consider this second layer to be my main layer. It's usually the main fabric that I'm trying to showcase in the ornament. And so I like to show a little bit more of it. Now this is totally personal preference. If you would like to come up a little bit closer and have this be smaller, you totally can. But I'm actually going to come down about there, and let me measure that so I can tell you exactly how far down that is. So at this point, it looks like I'm about a little bit, well, yeah, about 3/4 of an inch down from that point. And again, I'm just checking my lines, making sure that I'm staying straight. And here you can see what I meant with showing more of this layer. So where we are now, we just put on this piece here, and we've got a little bit more of the white showing here than what we did in these layers, and you can see that here too. These outer holly pieces are showing a little bit more than the rest of the holly. So let's go ahead and go directly opposite the piece that we just did. And you can totally play with this. This pattern is just the beginning. I mean, there are so many different variations you could do with this. You can do even more layers and more colors of fabric just by bringing your layers all closer together. You could make your center star smaller and then have a lot of really thin layers coming out. Something I've been wanting to do lately is an ombre type of ornament with just all one color, but starting light and then getting darker and having multiple layers coming out in order to form that ombre look. So there's just so many possibilities with these. Maybe I'll do that soon and do another video for you guys. I've even got the fabric already, I just haven't done it yet. All right, and then we've got one more to go to fill in this last section. Again, always checking those lines, making sure everything looks straight. All right, layer 3 is done. So we've got one more layer to go on this half of the ball, which is this red plaid. And you can see here what I did was I made this black layer, the one that we just added, a little thinner than the other layers. That way it's just simply an accent and there's not a whole bunch of it showing. And that's what we're gonna do here. So I'm taking my very first red rectangle, whoops, and I'm gonna go ahead and fold over that top edge just a little bit as usual, pinning a hair below that top folded edge. And now again, I wanna begin over the first 4 pieces that I did on that last layer. It's easy to tell which are the first 4 because they're the ones that are partially covered up by the last 4. So remember, those inner pieces are the ones that we did first. So I'm going to begin over one of those, and this time I'm actually only going to come down from that point just about 1/4 of an inch or so. So about there. And you can see now when I push that down, there's only a little bit of that black showing above the edge of my red. And I'm going to go ahead and fold down the left side and then the right side. And when I do that, you can see there's just a small sliver about 1/4 of an inch wide of that black fabric showing. which is exactly what I'm going for. Now again, I want to make sure that that line that I formed down the center of that red triangle lines up with all the lines below. And that's looking pretty good. Pinning down here at the very bottom. And then, of course, pinning my left or my right side down, and then my left side down. And we're gonna do that exact same thing all the way around. I have a habit of just going opposite, I just did this piece and then flipping the ball around and going opposite. You don't necessarily have to do that, but it's just something I like to do to kind of maintain that consistency. And if you're having a hard time eyeballing, you can use your tape measure to make sure that all your pieces are the same distance as you're working your way around the ball. Again, I came down about 1/4 of an inch from that black point. And I'm going to go ahead and do these two opposing pieces. All right, there's the first 4, and we're gonna do 4 more over top of those remaining black triangles. And this time I'm keeping them the same because I want that black line going around to be the same for all 8 of these pieces. Unlike what we did in the holly layer where we left a little bit more of the holly showing in the second half, the last 4 triangles, now we're keeping it a little bit more consistent. Again, another one of those things that you can play with. And after you make a few of these, they get so much faster. You'll be able to get through them so much quicker. The first time you make it, it may take you a couple of hours. But be patient, I promise you it gets easier and it gets quicker. All right, so that is side 1 totally done. We're gonna go ahead and flip this over, and I'm gonna show you how to begin side 2. You do side 2 exactly like you do side 1, but there is a way to make sure that when you begin side 2 that it will match up perfectly with side 1. It's always nice when you can look at the ornament from both sides and they match. That way when it's hanging on the tree, it looks the same from both directions instead of one side being kind of off from the other. So I'm gonna show you how to do that. So in order to make sure that everything is straight on side 2, matching up with side 1, we're gonna look at the lines that we have ended up with on side 1. Okay, so you've got, remember we were talking about those inner pieces that are partially covered up by these outer pieces? We're gonna be first looking at the inner pieces here. It doesn't matter which one, but pick an inner piece, and that's the ones, of course, that are partially covered up with the outer pieces. And what we wanna do here is take a tape measure and just line the tape measure up right along that center line that you created down the center of one of those inner triangles. So this one's actually easier to see. So I'm going to go ahead and take this tape measure and line it up right alongside that line going down the middle of an inner triangle. And I'm actually going to go ahead and take a pin and stick it halfway in to hold my tape measure in place. And I'm going to wrap this right through the center imprint of this unfinished side of the ball, and I'm going to bring it up and around to the opposite side of the ball so that it runs right along the center line of the exact opposite inner triangle. And I'm gonna go ahead and pin that in place again. So we've got this tape measure now just going right across the center from inner triangle center line to inner triangle center line. And I'm just gonna kind of hold this in place with my finger. Now I'm a lefty, so you'll probably do this with your right hand. You'll hold this with your left hand. I'm holding it with my right. But and I'm gonna take a pen and just draw a line. Oh, let's see if I can, there we go. Pen wasn't working for a second. And I'm gonna draw a light line right alongside that tape measure. Now, if you want to, you can use like a fabric pencil or something like that, but that, I figured this would show up better on the video for you. So now that I've got that line, I'm gonna go ahead and unpin my tape measure. And there's my line. Now, it might not always look centered in relation to the fabric, because remember, we've got a lot of unfinished pieces of fabric here. We weren't exact with our folding as far as how far we folded over our top edges and all that. So it's not always a good indication when you're just looking at the actual fabric edges, what is the center and, you know, all that stuff. So that's why we're kind of using these lines to find the perfect center of our second half. Now, where this technique is particularly useful is when you have a ball that doesn't have that imprint in the center. So right now we've got this imprint in the center, and it's giving us a pretty good indication of where the center is of that half of the ball. But if you don't have that, then doing lines like this is really going to help you. Now we're going to do the exact same thing directly perpendicular to that first line using the other inner triangle lines that we've got. So looking at this one here, I'm going to go ahead and line my tape measure right up alongside of that center line. I'm going to bring it right up through to the other side. And here is my directly opposing inner triangle, and I've got my tape measure lined up right alongside of it, and I'm going to go ahead and pin that in place as well. And then holding this in place, I'm just going to go ahead and draw a second line. Now, if you've got that imprint, this isn't quite as necessary, but it can actually be helpful because it's going to give us a guideline to line up our center triangle lines as we go to start putting these pieces on. So we're going to start with black again, just like we did on the first half of the ball. And remember, we need 4 pieces this time. And I'm going to go ahead and do my usual folds, folding over that top edge just a little bit, pinning through that top center. And now this time, we're going to use this line as our guideline of where to fold our triangles into place. So rather than just sticking in the center and folding, we're going to go ahead and pin this right into the center, right in the spot where those lines intersect. And then we're going to try to line this up so that our center line that we create follows that pen line that we just drew. And in turn, that's going to follow the lines from side 1. So I'm folding down my left side, and then I'm folding down my right side, keeping that line that I've created in line with my pen line, and that means it'll be in line with side 1. Pinning to hold both halves in place. Now you could do that without the lines. You could just make sure that when you folded this that you brought your pieces down, and the center line lines up. You could just flip it over and look. But in the beginning, you'll find this really helpful. After you've made a few, you may not need to draw those lines. So I'm getting my next rectangle of fabric ready. And actually, see how when I folded this, it's the folded top center is right on a snowflake? I'm actually going to fold it the other way because I kind of want the very center point of my triangle to be black, just because it's easier to see that point that way. And now again, remember, we want this pin to touch the point of our very first triangle. That way, when we create our triangle, there's no gap between. And I'm making sure that my center line lines up with the pen line. And then just filling in those 2 side gaps. Now, you may have noticed when I pinned right through that top center, I pinned really close. I pinned really close to the folded edge, and you can see just a little bit that I've got my pin head showing. So if you ever have that happening, that just means that you may have pinned a little bit too close to your folded edge. And you can just bring your pin down a tad. And that will help to hide that pin head. Now the opposite thing that can happen is you could put your pin a little bit too low, and then what will happen is you won't have a nice sharp point, plus you won't fill in that gap as easily because your fabric will be coming down lower. We're always trying to avoid the foam showing. Now some trick that I have actually seen the trick in other tutorials where people will put a square of fabric underneath before they begin. And that works too. That way, if you have a gap of fabric showing, or you've got a gap in the very center, I'm sorry, if you have a gap of foam showing, or if you've got a gap in the very center, well, that piece of fabric that's underneath will hide it. You'll never see it. I don't like to do that for a couple of reasons. Number one, because it's a waste of a piece of fabric. So I don't like to use a piece of fabric that's going to be completely covered up. And also because then you can't see your lines that you've drawn to find the very center of this half of the ball. So it's a little bit more haphazard that way. It certainly works to hide foam. So if you're having a really hard time hiding your foam, then that is a trick that you can use. But I would encourage you to try this way a couple times because it really does get easier after you do it a few times, I promise. Right, and again, I'm just making sure that I follow that line. I mean, it's kind of hidden under there, but making sure that I follow that pen line. All right, layer 1 done. Now we're going to go ahead and switch to that holly layer. And remember, this time we are going to be starting about, I think I had come down a 1/2 inch from my center point on side 1. It was about there, I believe. We'll go ahead and grab the tape measure and take a look. Yep, my pin's about a 1/2 inch. Remember, we're measuring off the very center point of this half of the ball. Creating my triangle, and now just making sure that I'm following the lines from side 1. If you can't see your pen line, you can always kind of lift up a little bit. There it is under there. You can kind of lift up and try to find it. Or if that's too hard, that means at this point you should be able to look at your side 1 line and measure off of that. Let's go ahead and flip it over and do the opposite. Again, coming down a 1/2 inch from my very center point. And if you're having a hard time finding that center point, or you kind of keep losing your place, you can always do that pin trick and stick a pin in the center. Actually, a pearl pin works really well too. You can push a pearl pin all the way down in there and it will show you exactly where that center point is really easily. And sometimes people even like to decorate the very center of their ornaments with a pearl pin. So if you want to do that, you could stick that in now and then leave it in there forever. Again, I'm just following my line. All right, so there is our first 4 pieces of this layer, and now we're going to go ahead and do those outer 4. So these were the inner 4 triangles, and now we're going to do the outer 4 triangles. This is our last 4 pieces of the holly fabric. Coming down the same distance off of that very center point of the ornament. And I'm just kind of shifting my triangle a little bit because I want to make sure that this lines up with that opposing line from side 1. Now I'm a little off center, so I'm going to just shift this pin over to the left a little bit. Okay, that looks a lot better. And you can see I don't have any foam showing anymore. And that is totally okay. Two more to go. All right, side or layer 2 is all done. You'll see that you've just now begun to overlap side 1 with your fabric. It's just barely starting to overlap. If it's not starting to overlap, that's okay, but if it is, it may look like this. That is also fine. So what we're gonna do with layer 3 and beyond is we'll start trimming any excess fabric, and basically we're going for our center line to be right around here, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that as it happens. Let's go ahead and switch to our black again. We're going to do that thin accent layer of black fabric. So I think we came down another 1/2 inch here on this one. So we're starting over those inner 4 holly triangles. Again, they're the ones that are kind of covered up. Our last 4 triangles are bigger and show more of the fabric, and our inner ones are kind of covered up. So I'm going to come down off of one of those, creating my triangle, and now this time making sure that my line lines up not only with the half that we're on, but also with side 1. Just like that. Placing a pin to hold both sides in place. Now here, where we are starting to get a little bit of overlap into the first half of the ball, what we want to do here is we want to put our pins up a tiny bit higher than what we've been. So rather than pinning all the way in the very bottom corner and the very well, right here the bottom did work fine, but if it was extending more into side 1, we would want to keep that pin up a little bit higher, and that way any excess fabric that we have that is extending into side 1, we will be able to trim off. If you pin all the way down here, we won't be able to trim that excess fabric that is going into side 1. We wouldn't be able to trim that off. So just keep that in mind. We're basically just trying to keep a nice even line of pins going all the way around the circumference of the ball, right about where that equator line was when we could see it. Okay, you can kind of envision that that's where it is, right there in the center. And now I'm moving opposite of the triangle that I just placed. Piece of fabric that's directly opposite the one we did. Creating that triangle, making sure my line is lined up, and then again making sure my line is lined up over here with side 2. And I know I keep harping on that, but that's just because it makes such a difference in the finished ornament. Like, I'll show you really quick what I mean. It's really nice when you can look at the ornament from the side and all those center lines line up with each other. Now, this being a plaid fabric, there's like a lot of lines going on here, so it might not be as easy to see, but when you have a more simple fabric, or one that is not like full of lines itself, you can really see those lines. They really stand out, and it's nice when they all line up with each other, going all the way around the ball. Anyway, also what I just did here was the same as what I did opposite. I made sure I kept my pins up a little bit higher than normal so that I will have this extra fabric that I can trim when I'm done the layer. So now we've got 2 more inner triangles to cover. So we're going to go ahead and move to this one. Again, creating that triangle, lining up all my lines. Again, you can see how high I'm keeping my pins so that I can trim all that off. All right, there is the first 4 pieces. And what I'm gonna do before I do my second 4 black pieces, I'm actually gonna go ahead and trim these first 4. It's just easier that way, I feel like. And all I'm doing is taking my scissors and just carefully trimming off below the pin line. Now what you want to do here is make sure you don't accidentally do this. You don't want to accidentally stick the blade of your scissors into side one because that's really hard to fix. Just be real careful. I always like to make sure I can see the end of my blade before I start cutting. And then we'll do our final 4 black pieces. We're moving right along. We've only got one more layer after this. So remember here, I actually came down a little further this time. I came down a 1/2 inch for those first 4 black pieces, but on this one, I'm coming down about 3/4 inch from the point of each of these triangles. So let me just make sure that's where I'm at. And yeah, the top of my black piece is about 3/4 inch. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And what that means is this time we're going to have even more excess that's extending into side one. So we're going to go ahead and make sure that we pin up even a little higher. And you can kind of feel, like when you're holding down this triangle, you can feel where the center of the ball should be. And that'll help you to determine where to stick the pin. You just want to keep it even with that line you already made. So see how right there, now we'll be able to trim all this off, and the trim line will be consistent with the other line that from the other pieces that we cut. All right, there we go. 2 more to go. So this one, I'm looking at my line. See how my line's kind of over here? So what I'm going to do, I don't think I'm going to be able to make that perfect, but I am going to shift this over just a tiny bit to the left to just kind of help me match up with that line over there a little bit better. And that's a little closer. And I'm just kind of looking at it to make sure it still looks good from the front, and it does. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and trim these final 4 black pieces the same way we did the first 4 pieces. Take your time with this part so you don't accidentally cut anything that you shouldn't. And there we go, and you'll have a nice even line going around the middle. And now we've just got 1 more layer to go on this half of the ball. We've got 8 more red triangles to create. And again, we're going to start on the first 4 inner black triangles from the 3rd layer. And this time we're making that black layer a tiny bit more narrow. We want only a small sliver, about 1/4 inch of that black layer to show. So I'm coming down from that black tip just about 1/4 inch. Creating that triangle, and now it's a little easier to match your triangles up with side one because you're even closer now. And here, when you pin, you want to pin right in the center between the 2 halves, because this last line of raw edges is going to be right in the center of the ball, and that's what we're going to take our band and cover. Okay, so just like before, I'm going to go ahead and give these first 4 a trim before I start the second 4. Oops, sorry. I realize sometimes when I'm trimming, I kind of bring it closer to me and then I go off camera a little bit. Sorry about that. All right, last 4. We are almost there. Okay, now we have one last trim and then we are good. We will be ready to put the band on and then embellish. It is time for the band. So you're going to take your long strip of fabric. Again, this is going to be somewhere between 2 to 2.5 inches wide by 10.5 to 11 inches long, depending on the thickness of your fabrics. The thicker the fabrics that were in your ornament, then the longer your band is going to need to be in order to wrap all the way around the ball. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this and hold it with the pattern side facing away. And then we're going to fold one side of the fabric in about halfway or so. Now again, this is actually something that can be adjusted. If you have a very wide section of raw edges to cover, like maybe you've got kind of pins that are sort of far apart from each other and you've got more to cover, then you're going to want to fold this in less than what I'm about to do because you want a wider band in the end. If you have a less area to cover, then you'll want to make your band a little bit more narrow, and in that case you want to fold over more. So I'm kind of in the middle here. This is a thick fabric. The ornament that I made is kind of thick because of that brushed cotton in the last layer. So I'm going to fold mine about 1/3 of the way in like this. And then I'm going to do the exact opposite with the other side. And I've got a band about this width. Again, to make a wider band, fold it in less. Again, fold it in less on the other side and you've got a wider band. This is something that can just totally be adjusted as needed. So now you've got a raw edge running alongside the bottom of this piece of fabric. And what we're going to do is flip it over so that the raw edge is on the bottom and it's hidden. And we're going to go ahead and place this on top of one section of the raw edges. Now what I like to do is I like to look at the ornament from the front and just kind of flip it around a little bit and decide what I want the top to be. Now sometimes you'll look at your ball and there might be a section that looks a little bit funky, like maybe your star is a little bit off or something, and so it can make a difference when you're looking at it from the front what would look good hanging. Like right here, this would not look good as the top because I don't know, something looks off over here so it doesn't look right. So I'm just going to kind of flip this around, and actually I think I like that. I think I like it with this being the top here. So I'm going to go ahead and stick my band right over top of that section. And again, also don't forget to look at it from the other side too because you've got two sides, so you want them to look good on both directions. But anyway, once you've found where you want it to be, go ahead and start that band right there at that top, and you can stick 1 or 2 pins in to hold it in place. I like to do 2 just like that. And then what you're going to do is you're just going to continue that fold all the way down and around, covering all of those raw edges and working your way around the ball until you come back to the top. Now you want to kind of pull this snug so that when you look at it from the side, you don't see like a really big bulky, like pillowy looking messy band like that, like what I'm kind of loosening it up. You want it to be snug so that it looks nice, but you also don't want to yank it so tight that you pull the fabric out of like whack. You don't want it to look distorted or anything like that. So just kind of like pull it tight enough so that you have a nice snug band. Pull it all the way around, covering up all those raw edges. And this can take some practice the first time you do it, but I promise you it gets easier. And you're going to pull this all the way up until you reach the very top starting point of the band. And then you're going to go ahead and stick another pin or 2 to hold it in place. So here's what it should look like. It should be even on both sides. And then once you're happy and you know you're happy and you're not going to take it back out and do it again, then go ahead and trim off any excess that's behind those pins. All right, so now you've got no raw edges showing anywhere on the ball, which is pretty cool. So what we're going to do now is go ahead and make bows, and we're going to get those pine cones and berries ready and embellish this. So we'll start by getting the bows ready, and I'm going to use the black bow on the bottom. And what you want to do is just take that piece of ribbon and then stick a pin right through the end of your ribbon. And again, this is about 24 inches in length. Now you can adjust this if you're using your own materials and you don't have one of our kits. You can make a smaller bow or a longer bow depending on what you like. I kind of like bows to be about that size. I don't like them to be too big, and I also don't like them to be too small. So this is kind of what I like to do, about 24 inches. And you're going to loop about 3 or 4 inches from that pin like this, and then pin through it again. So that's about 3.5 inches, I think. And we're going to do the exact same thing again, looping it back and sticking a pin through again. And you're just going to continue doing this until you've reached the end of the ribbon. Now, if you're having a hard time getting even loops, you can actually use a tape measure and just measure out each loop and pin through until you get the hang of eyeballing. So that worked out pretty well. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to just stick this right into the top of the ball, right over top of that last raw edge. So I forgot a minute ago I said there's no more raw edges. There is this one little last raw edge. We're going to cover that though with the bow. And you can kind of fan it out a little bit and make sure it looks the way that you want it to look. And I'm going to set that guy aside for a second, and I'm going to make a second bow with my next piece of ribbon. Pinning through the end, and then again just creating my loops. Now I forgot to mention too in the very beginning of this video, which was silly of me, this black ribbon is 1/4 inch wide, and then this burgundy ribbon is 3/8 of an inch wide. So they're both narrow ribbons. You can find narrow ribbons in almost any craft store, and they usually have all different kinds. You can have fun picking out ribbons. So I got my loops a little bit bigger on this one, and so I only have room for 6 loops this time. And that's actually going to be okay for me because I want to have room for my bow, or for my berries and my pine cones. So I'm going to go ahead and just snip off this excess. That's the loop. I think I got a little big there. And I'm going to set this aside for a second. And I'm going to go ahead and prepare these guys. So these come on a long stem, but what I want to do is trim off so that I've only got about 3/4 of an inch or so of stem. And that's what I'm going to be using to tuck into my bow. So I'm going to grab my wire cutters, and I'm just going to go ahead and snip off. And again, like I said, scissors will work for this too. I mean, it's not very strong wire, but I would recommend you use like a wire cutter if you have them. And I'm just going to see if that looks like a good, yeah, that looks pretty good to me. So about that distance, let me go ahead and measure that so I can give you an exact, oh, that's closer to an inch. Okay, so you want to leave about an inch or so of your wire. And we'll do the same for all 4. That one just flew across the room. All right, so now what I'm gonna do is I've got my bow ready. It's important you get your second bow ready because what we're gonna do is put some glue on the top. We're gonna go ahead and place those pine cones and berries and then immediately stick our last bow right on top before the glue gets too dry. And actually, we're also gonna go ahead and get the hanger ready before I glue this as well. And wouldn't you know it, I forgot to tell you one other thing that we've got in the kit is a little burl pin. You could even use a regular pin for this, but it's always nice to use something decorative for your hanger because this is going to be the one pin that shows in the finished ornament. So what I'm doing is I'm taking my last shorter piece of ribbon and I'm going to go ahead and stick a pin right through both of those ends to hold them together and hold that loop in place. And I'm setting that aside as well. So I'm going to go ahead and stick a little dollop of glue right on top. I got my hot glue heating up here beside me. And I'm just going to stick a little dollop up there. Enough that I can put all 4 of those stems in place. And again, you could also use like a tacky craft glue or something like that. So I'm going to just go ahead and start placing these guys. I am going to kind of do a bead and a pine cone on each side of the ornament. So right here is one of the sides. I've got the other side over here. And I want, when you're looking at this ornament from either side, I would like you to be able to see a pine cone and a berry. And honestly, well, I'm not going to change it now. I'm thinking maybe I should have put the berry on that side, but oh well. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and stick my last bow right on top. And of course I bent my pin. That is never fun. When you bend the pin, it makes it a lot harder to push in. So I've got a trick for you if this ever happens to you. You can use extra fabric to push a pin into place if it's really hard to push. And it will help save your fingers. Alrighty, there we go. And now when you look at it from the front and from the back, you can see those little pine cones. And then finally, we'll go ahead and stick our last pin, that pearl pin with that hanger, right into the top. And I'm pushing this a little slower so I don't bend it this time. And there we go. Now once your glue dries completely, you'll actually be able to take the stems, the pine cone and berry stems, and you can kind of like adjust them a little bit. You can sort of like bend them a little bit so that you can put the pine cones and the berries just exactly where you want them, which is really nice. But I would give it a few minutes before you try to do that because the glue will take a minute to dry. All right, and there you go. I hope that you had fun making this. And if you've got any questions or if there's anything that I forgot to explain, please just let me know in the comments below and I will help you out the best that I can. Thanks for watching.